You're leading in every race. You're leading in every state. You're leading in the country against both Republican and Democrat. And Biden, you're leading in the country by a lot. And can you take the person that's leading everywhere and say, hey, we're not going to let you run? You know, I think that's pretty tough to do, but I'm leaving it up to the Supreme Court.
Today, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in the case to decide whether Donald Trump is eligible to appear on primary ballots in the state of Colorado. Now, Colorado, of course, made the decision to boot Donald Trump from primary ballots under the 14th Amendment, and formal challenges to Donald Trump's presidential candidacy have been filed in at least 35 states. Now, challenges in 15 states have already been dismissed, 18 are pending, and Colorado and Maine disqualified him. But decisions in both these states have been appealed, which is why the Supreme Court was hearing oral arguments today. Now, before we get into the oral arguments and how the justices reacted, here's a brief explanation of what the case is all about.
The Supreme Court has never considered this issue. It involves an obscure part of the Constitution, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. It was passed after the Civil War, and it says, I'm going to read it, it says, no person shall hold any office who took an oath as an officer of the United States, but then engaged in insurrection. Now, challenges filed in at least 35 states argue this clause applies to Trump because he engaged in insurrection on January 6th, and so he's disqualified from running for president. The Colorado Supreme Court was the first to agree, followed by Maine Secretary of State. Both said that Trump should be removed from their state's primary ballots and not be able to run for president. Now, if the justices uphold that Colorado decision, that's going to jumpstart efforts in these other states to also take him off the ballot.
Now, I'm going to speculate right off the bat that the Supreme Court is not going to uphold the decision by Colorado and Maine, but let's get into the details of some of the arguments made by those who want to see Donald Trump on the ballot, by those representing Donald Trump's arguments here. So one of the arguments made by Trump lawyer Jonathan Mitchell was that the language of the 14th Amendment does not apply to the president, does not apply to Donald Trump. I think this is the weakest argument, but I'll tell you exactly what he said. So Trump's lawyers have argued that the presidency is not an officer of the United States. And so, they say, Trump isn't covered by the disqualification provision at all, even if he did commit insurrection. They argue that the phrase officer of the United States is a legal term of art that refers to appointed officials, not elected ones. I personally think that's the weakest argument, but let's put that aside for now. Let's go to some of the stronger arguments. His lawyer also argued that January 6th was not a riot, or was a riot, not an insurrection, and that Trump didn't really engage in it. Now look, as we all know, the riot wasn't really the insurrection, right? The meat of the matter lied in the fact that Donald Trump and his co-conspirators had installed fake electors in order to overturn the results of the election. And the riot was really a distraction to allow for the full implementation of that as soon as the vice president says that he's gonna reject the Electoral College votes. And we've talked about this multiple times. So again, it's not just about the riot, it's also about the fake elector scheme. Hold on, let me just give you the argument that Mitchell made. Now, additionally, Mitchell focused on whether the states actually have the power to remove the presidential candidate from the ballot before Congress gives explicit approval to do so. Justice Elena Kagan pushed Jason Murray, the attorney for the Colorado voters, on this question of how much power the states should wield over federal elections. Let's listen.
I think that the question that you have to confront is why a single state should decide who gets to be president of the United States. If you weren't from Colorado and you were from Wisconsin or you were from Michigan, and it really, what the Michigan Secretary of State did is going to make the difference between whether candidate A is elected or candidate B is elected. I mean, that seems quite extraordinary, doesn't it?
No, Your Honor, because ultimately it's this court that's going to decide that question of federal constitutional eligibility and settle the issue for the nation.
We might have millions of people watching this show, but you can be the difference maker, because we just need 1% of our audience to be paid members, and then this show can be around forever. So you can make that difference. Click join now.
Now, Justice Kagan, of course, is one of the quote unquote liberal justices, but Justice Amy Coney Barrett echoed the concerns. She's a conservative justice, adding it just doesn't seem like a state call. In response, Murray argued that each state would still have the ability to determine what appears on their own ballots, despite what officials in another state might decide. Cenk.
Yeah, so look, I'm both objective and biased on that last issue, and I have to state my bias for you guys just on policy grounds, not on political grounds. So I'm a naturalized citizen, and that ruling could very much apply to me as well, because what the Trump guys are arguing for, and it appears both liberal and conservative justices seem to be agreeing with, is it is not up to the states to decide who's constitutionally qualified, because if they have varied decisions, well, any one state like Michigan can unilaterally decide that a nationwide election by denying someone a place on the ballot. So the states cannot decide if someone is constitutionally eligible. That is for the courts to decide, in which case all of those candidates get to go on the ballot. Trump, naturalized citizens, etc. And so that is very interesting, and obviously I agree with that. So now number two that Anna mentioned was, is it an insurrection? Now I think that it's an insurrection for the reasons that Anna stated, the fake elector plot, which was a literal coup attempt on our democracy. But it has not been adjudicated as an insurrection. In fact, Trump hasn't even been charged with insurrection. And he's been charged with many things, including about January 6th. So if prosecutors thought they couldn't even prove an insurrection case, why does Colorado get to decide on their own that it was an insurrection and then change the entire nationwide election? So I think the justices' doubts, and they all have doubts here. This is not breaking along conservative and liberal lines as normal cases do, I think are correct. Well, who gets to decide what an insurrection is? If he's convicted of one, either by Congress or the courts, okay, that's a different issue. But if he hasn't been convicted in either place, I don't think an individual state gets to decide on their own, and that seems to be the direction they're going in. I agree with Anna too that the whole debate over whether he's an officer or not is a giant waste of time.
That's such a weak argument.
Yeah, he's definitely an officer. I don't know why they're wasting their time with that, but okay, fine.
Now, Brett Kavanaugh also told the lawyer representing Colorado, Murray, that his position disenfranchises voters. And I'm giving you this sound mostly because I think it's yet another example of how the Supreme Court is very likely going to strike down the decision by Colorado and Maine. Let's watch.
What about the idea that we should think about democracy, think about the right of the people to elect candidates of their choice, of letting the people decide, because your position has the effect of disenfranchising voters to a significant degree. And should that be something, does that come in when we think about should we read Section 3 this way or read it that way? What about the background principle, if you agree, of democracy?
This case illustrates the danger of refusing to apply Section 3 as written, because the reason we're here is that President Trump tried to disenfranchise 80 million Americans who voted against him, and the Constitution doesn't require that he be given another chance.
So I think he makes a good point there. I think Jason Murray makes a good point there, the lawyer representing Colorado. But I think that your point, Cenk, and the point that I've also made on the show previously about how Trump has not been charged with or convicted of insurrection makes that argument a little trickier to make, a little more difficult to make.
Yeah, and so even, by the way, this is interesting. Even Trump's own lawyer admitted that January 6th was, quote, shameful, criminal, and violent.
And well, it was.
And well, I know, but Republicans deny reality. They think that it was a tourist visit from Antifa, but it was positive and it was led by the deep state, and it was a picnic and all that. You know, so here is Trump's own lawyer saying, yes, our fans were shameful, criminal, and violent, right? So, but nevertheless, there was no adjudication of an insurrection. So here we are being fair and honest about Trump and his ability to win this case, and it might come out 9-0. And so that would be, if that's the case, that would be the liberal justices being principled, which the conservative justices don't do that often. And lastly, Trump has lost 93% of the cases where his administration, when he was president, went to court because he says absurd things in court. He lost over 60 cases when adjudicating whether the 2020 election was stolen from him, and he never presented any evidence. He almost always loses in court because that's the realm of evidence. But in this case, since the case was so weak, he's almost certainly going to win. And then what is MAGA gonna think? Well, you guys brought him to court on all these different things. This is the first and only case where well, that's not true, we have the civil cases, but outside of the civil cases, where we have a ruling, and the ruling is in favor of Trump. See, we told you, we were right all along, Trump's right about everything. Now that's not true, those two things are totally different, but they will conclude that as soon as the Supreme Court says Trump was right about this.
Now, final thing I'll mention is David Axelrod, who was an advisor to President Obama, is not in favor of keeping Donald Trump off of state ballots. He made his case recently, so let's hear him out and then I'll give you more.
I'm trying to imagine what it would be like if the Supreme Court said, we're removing the front-running Republican candidate from the ballot and essentially saying to the American people, you won't have the opportunity to vote for him. And I think it would be very, very disruptive in this country. I think it will create a huge reaction, and that worries me. It worries me partly because of Donald Trump. There's so much cynicism about our institutions already, and the strength of our democracy are these institutions. You can argue that, well, that's why you have to go the way the Colorado court suggests, but I think in the minds of many voters, this would be a subversion, and it would draw a very strong reaction.
And not only would it draw strong reaction, I just think anything that Democrats do against Republicans will then be utilized against Democrats tenfold. Okay, so if you're going to keep someone who hasn't been convicted of insurrection off of state ballots, well, couldn't Republicans turn around and do the same thing to Democrats?
Of course, and Republicans, they'll use the most nonsensical fig leaf you've ever heard. I heard Joe Biden was jaywalking, that's it, he's off the ballot. You're like, wait, that doesn't make any sense. Oh, we're keeping people off the ballot? The Republicans would knock out like 80% of the Democrats on ballots across the country.
Look, I mean, Biden did, I think, accidentally take classified documents home with him, right? And as soon as he discovered them, he let the feds know and they took the documents. It's completely different from how Donald Trump handled the classified documents. But nonetheless, wouldn't the Republicans be able to say like, wow, look at that serious security risk that President Joe Biden engaged in?
Yeah.
Should we keep him off the ballots? He really put the country in jeopardy with these top secret classified documents.
That really has nothing to do with insurrection, but they're gonna say, well, January 6th wasn't an insurrection, you never proved it, right? So look, guys, this is a very dangerous game to play. We told you from day one, this is not the right direction to go in towards taking Trump off the ballots, right? But last thing here is the politics of it. Look at how poorly the Democrats played this. So the one case where they pushed forward that got to the Supreme Court is the one they're gonna lose, probably 9-0, okay? Unanimous decision in favor of Trump. Every other case, they started so late, they might not get any convictions at all before Trump, before we get to the general election, let alone the fact that it would have helped most in the primaries, and it totally missed the primary window because they started so late. So they bungled it in both directions. And ultimately, the person who's most guilty out of all the Democrats in the country is Merrick Garland. So if you thought he did an insurrection, brother, you should have prosecuted him for insurrection, and you should have started on day one. And by now, we would have either gotten a conviction or an acquittal on insurrection, and this would have been easy to decide. But instead, that pathetic, elitist protecting ghoul sat on his ass for 2.5 years, and then when they realized Trump's gonna run against them, panicked and said, oh yeah, let's do some cases against him.
Which is sick because it shows how politically motivated that effort was, as opposed to getting to the bottom of the situation and ensuring that the outcome is based on what's right for the country and it's based on justice.
And I need you to understand, both things can be true at the same time. That Donald Trump is guilty, he did do all those things, but the timing of the cases can still be political.
Yes.
They weren't gonna bring them because he was one of the elites. And when they realize he's gonna run again, they're like, oh no, we have to prosecute one of the elites, a thing we hate doing, but we have to do it because of political considerations. And so that is why the Republicans are pissed, and I understand why they're pissed. But the Democrats are also pissed. Why didn't you bring the cases earlier? They're the worst, and they deserve everything they get.
Hey, thanks for watching that video. We really appreciate it, guys. And we appreciate it if you become members, because that allows us to be independent, honest, progressive, all the things that you don't get from corporate media. And all of that is because of you guys. Hit the join button below and become one of us. Become a Young Turk.